The heat of the moment. Officer Daniel "Danny" Marks had been a cop for nearly a decade, and he prided himself on being the kind of officer who didn't back down. However, that morning, he woke up with a splitting headache and a simmering frustration that had built over weeks of unrelenting stress. Crime rates in his precinct were climbing, and his own life felt like it was spiraling out of control. His marriage was on the rocks, and his superiors were on his case about a string of unsolved street gang crimes. By the time the dispatch call came in about an incident at a local street corner involving a traffic collision, Danny was already at the edge of his patience. The call was vague. Multiple vehicles involved, a possible injury, and a group of bystanders creating a disturbance. When Danny arrived at the scene, the chaos was in full swing. 3 cars were piled up at an intersection, their crumpled frames blocking traffic. A small crowd of bystanders surrounded an ambulance, where paramedics were loading a man onto a stretcher. The streetlights painted the scene in a harsh, flickering glow. "Step back, everyone," Danny barked as he approached the scene, his hand resting on his belt. His authoritative tone had little effect on the restless crowd. He caught fragments of their conversations, words like "doctor," "important," and "ambulance," but he was too focused on asserting control to pay attention. One man, tall and broad-shouldered, stood closer to the ambulance than the rest, waving his arms in frustration. "They're taking too long. Do something," the man shouted. His voice grated on Danny's nerves, and the officer's temper flared. "Hey, back off and let them work," Danny ordered, stepping toward the man. Instead of complying, the man turned and glared at Danny. "Why don't you back off? You don't know what's going on here." Danny's vision narrowed, and the words felt like a challenge. He didn't think, he acted. His fist flew, connecting squarely with the man's jaw. The sickening thud of the punch echoed in the air, silencing the murmuring crowd. The man staggered backward, hitting the pavement with a groan. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Danny's chest heaved, his anger still boiling, but then the crowd's shocked gasps brought him back to reality. He looked down at his trembling hand, the one he had just used to strike another human being. His eyes darted to the man on the ground. That's when he saw the man's face clearly for the first time. The victim wasn't some random troublemaker. It was a middle-aged black man dressed in what looked like scrubs. A badge clipped to his shirt read Dr. Philip Johnson. Panic set in. Inside the ambulance, the paramedics scrambled to stabilize another patient. Danny heard the faint whirring of medical equipment and muffled voices calling for urgency. "What the hell did you just do?" A woman shouted from the crowd. She stepped forward, phone raised, recording the entire scene. Her voice was filled with disbelief and righteous anger. "You just punched a doctor. What's wrong with you?" Danny's stomach dropped. The crowd began to murmur more loudly, their tones shifting from shock to outrage. His mind raced as he tried to process what he had done. He hadn't just punched a man. He had assaulted someone who was likely saving lives. A voice from inside the ambulance called out, "We need to move. Now." Danny glanced toward the vehicle, his eyes catching sight of a stretcher carrying another patient, someone who appeared gravely injured. The paramedics didn't wait. They slammed the ambulance doors shut and sped off, sirens wailing into the night. The woman with the phone kept filming. "You think you're untouchable, huh? Just wait until people see this." Danny took a step back, sweat dripping down his temples. His heart pounded as he tried to steady his breathing. He had messed up, badly. And now, standing amidst an increasingly angry crowd, he realized the full weight of his actions hadn't even begun to sink in. The fallout begins. The ambulance's sirens wailed into the night, growing fainter with each passing second. But the chaos it left behind on the street was only beginning to boil. Officer Danny Marks stood frozen, his mind racing with conflicting thoughts. The man he had punched, Dr. Philip Johnson, was being helped to his feet by bystanders. Blood trickled from the corner of the doctor's mouth, and his sharp, piercing gaze locked onto Danny's. "You don't even know what you've done," Dr. Johnson spat, his voice shaky but seething with controlled fury. His words hit harder than any punch Danny had ever thrown or taken in his life. Around them, the crowd began to close in, their voices swelling into a cacophony of anger and disbelief. "How can you just hit a man like that?" A young woman shouted, her phone still recording. Another man added, "You're supposed to protect us, not attack us." Danny's mouth felt dry as sandpaper, but he forced himself to speak. "Back up," he barked, his voice lacking its usual authority. Everyone needs to step back. But this time, no one obeyed. The respect he'd once commanded as a police officer had evaporated in the heat of his reckless actions. Dr. Johnson wiped the blood from his mouth with the back of his hand and took a shaky step forward. "You hit me," he said slowly, as if trying to wrap his own mind around the absurdity of the situation. His voice was calm, but the underlying anger was unmistakable. "You don't even know who I am, do you?" Danny's jaw tightened. He wanted to say something, anything, to justify what he'd done, but he couldn't find the words. Instead, he glanced at the doctor's ID badge, which hung loosely from his torn scrub top. The name Dr. Philip Johnson was printed boldly under the emblem of a prestigious hospital. That's when it hit Danny. This wasn't just any man. This was someone important. Before he could respond, the woman with the phone stepped closer. "What's your badge number, officer?" she demanded, her tone dripping with contempt. Danny instinctively covered his badge with his hand, but the woman smirked. Too late. Got it on camera. His heart sank. This wasn't just a bad moment. It was a career-ending disaster unfolding in real time. Every second felt like an eternity as the crowd's anger grew louder and more volatile. People weren't just upset about the punch. They were furious at what it symbolized. "You think you can just do this because he's black?" An older man yelled from the back of the crowd. His words hung heavy in the air, and suddenly, the narrative shifted. Danny could see it in their eyes. They weren't just looking at a cop who'd lost control. They were looking at a symbol of systemic abuse, a cog in a machine they had learned to distrust. Danny's chest tightened as the weight of their accusations pressed down on him. He wanted to scream that it wasn't about race, that he'd acted out of frustration, not prejudice. But deep down, even he knew those words would sound hollow. How could he explain himself when he barely understood why he'd done it? Before the situation could escalate further, another squad car pulled up, its lights flashing. Officer Rebecca Hayes, Danny's partner for the night, stepped out. Her eyes darted between Danny and the crowd, quickly assessing the situation. "What the hell is going on here, Danny?" she hissed under her breath as she approached him. Danny didn't answer. He couldn't. Rebecca turned to the crowd, raising her hands in a calming gesture. "All right, everyone, we need you to clear the scene," she said, her voice firm but measured. "We're handling this." But the crowd wasn't having it. Handling it. The woman with the phone snapped. "Your partner just assaulted a man for no reason. We're not going anywhere until you do something about him." Rebecca's eyes narrowed as she turned to Danny, her expression a mixture of disbelief and anger. "Did you really hit someone?" she asked quietly, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "It was a mistake," Danny muttered, his voice barely audible. "I thought." "You thought what?" Rebecca interrupted, her tone sharp. "Because from where I'm standing, this looks really bad." Dr. Johnson stepped forward again, his composure returning despite the obvious pain he was in. "Officer Hayes," he said, addressing Rebecca directly. "Your partner attacked me without provocation. I was trying to ensure the safety of a critically injured patient, and he gestured toward Danny with a look of disgust, decided to throw a punch instead of doing his job." Rebecca's face paled as she turned back to Danny. "Is that true?" Danny looked away, unable to meet her gaze. His silence was all the confirmation she needed. "All right," Rebecca said, her voice tight. She turned back to Dr. Johnson. "I assure you, sir, this will be investigated thoroughly. If you'd like, I can take your statement now." Dr. Johnson shook his head. "I'll be filing my report with Internal Affairs," he said coldly. "And trust me, this isn't over." Danny felt the ground beneath him shift, as if he were standing on the edge of a collapsing cliff. He'd always considered himself a good cop, someone who followed the rules and did his best to serve his community. But now, in the eyes of the crowd, the department, and perhaps even himself, he was just another bad apple. As Dr. Johnson walked away, his head held high despite his injuries, Danny realized the man he'd punched wasn't just a victim. He was a witness, a respected professional whose voice carried weight. And if that weren't bad enough, the patient in the ambulance, whoever they were, could add another layer of complexity to this nightmare. Rebecca grabbed Danny's arm, pulling him aside. "Listen to me," she said in a hushed, urgent tone. "This is serious. You need to get ahead of this before it spirals out of control." Danny nodded numbly. "What do I do?" "For starters," Rebecca said, her voice firm, "you pray that the person in that ambulance survives. And then you figure out a damn good explanation for Internal Affairs, because they're going to eat you alive." Danny swallowed hard, the full weight of his actions finally crashing down on him. This wasn't just about a punch, it was about everything that punch represented. And no matter how much he wanted to take it back, there was no undoing what had been done. The fallout had already begun, and the consequences were coming for him faster than he could comprehend. A wound that won't heal. The ride back to the precinct felt longer than it should have. Danny sat in the passenger seat of Rebecca's squad car, staring out at the rain-soaked streets. He hadn't said a word since leaving the scene, and Rebecca, sensing the tension, didn't push him. The occasional crackle of the police radio filled the silence, but it only served to heighten the anxiety clawing at Danny's chest. His hands rested on his knees, trembling slightly. He clenched them into fists to make them stop, but the tension in his body wouldn't ease. Images from the confrontation replayed in his mind. The moment his fist connected with Dr. Johnson's face, the stunned silence of the crowd, and the blood trickling from the doctor's lip. "What were you thinking?" Rebecca finally asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of her disbelief. "I wasn't," Danny replied after a long pause. "It just happened." Rebecca shot him a sidelong glance, her knuckles tightening on the steering wheel. "That's not good enough, Danny. You don't just lose control like that. Not in this job." Danny didn't respond. He couldn't. Deep down, he knew she was right, but admitting it felt like acknowledging the end of his career, a career he'd worked so hard to build. The precinct was quieter than usual when they arrived. The dim fluorescent lights flickered in the hallway as they made their way to the locker room. Danny avoided eye contact with the few officers they passed, his badge weighing heavily on his chest like a scarlet letter. "Go get cleaned up," Rebecca said as they entered the locker room. "You look like hell." Danny nodded absently, his mind still far from the present. He splashed cold water on his face in front of the sink, staring at his reflection in the cracked mirror. The man staring back at him looked older than he remembered, his eyes hollow and lined with exhaustion. Was this who he had become? A man defined by his mistakes. The locker room door creaked open, and Danny turned to see Captain Jameson stepping in. The captain's expression was unreadable, but the tension in his jaw told Danny everything he needed to know. "Marks, in my office. Now," Jameson said curtly before turning and walking out. Danny's stomach churned as he followed the captain down the hall. Rebecca shot him a sympathetic look as he passed her desk, but it did little to ease the dread building inside him. When they reached the office, Jameson closed the door behind them and motioned for Danny to sit. "Care to explain what the hell happened tonight?" Jameson began, leaning forward with his hands clasped on the desk. Danny hesitated, searching for the right words. "There was a lot going on," he said finally. "The scene was chaotic, and you thought it was a good idea to punch a man in front of half the neighborhood." Jameson interrupted, his voice rising. "Not just any man, Marks, a doctor. Do you have any idea what kind of fallout we're dealing with right now? Danny's silence spoke volumes. Jameson rubbed his temples, letting out a heavy sigh. Internal Affairs is already involved. They want a full report from you by tomorrow morning. And let me make one thing clear. If Dr. Johnson presses charges, you're on your own. The department won't protect you. Danny felt his chest tighten. I didn't mean for it to happen like that, he said weakly. I thought. You thought wrong. Jameson snapped, slamming his fist on the desk. This isn't about what you thought. This is about what you did. And what you did, Marks, is put this entire precinct under scrutiny. The words hit like a sledgehammer. Danny wanted to argue, to defend himself, but he knew it would be futile. The damage was done, and there was no undoing it. Jameson leaned back in his chair, his expression softening slightly. Listen, Danny, he said, his tone quieter now. I've known you for a long time. I know you're not a bad cop, but this is bad. You need to figure out how to fix it, and fast. How? Danny asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jameson didn't answer right away. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the desk. Start with this, he said. It's Dr. Johnson's file. Maybe understanding who he is will help you figure out what you need to do next. Danny hesitated before picking up the folder. He flipped it open, scanning the contents. Dr. Philip Johnson was a decorated surgeon with years of experience in trauma medicine. He had worked in some of the most dangerous parts of the city, saving countless lives. But what caught Danny's attention was a small note in the file. Consultant for community outreach programs, advocating for systemic reform in law enforcement. His stomach sank. Dr. Johnson wasn't just a doctor. He was a prominent figure in the fight for police accountability. The man he had punched was someone who had likely spent years working to improve the very system Danny was now at risk of being ejected from. As Danny closed the folder, he felt a pang of regret unlike anything he'd ever experienced. This wasn't just about his career anymore. It was about the trust he'd shattered, not just with Dr. Johnson, but with the community he was supposed to serve. I'll handle it, Danny said finally, his voice steadier than before. You'd better, Jameson replied, his tone grim. Because if you don't, this won't just end your career, it'll define it. Danny left the office with the folder tucked under his arm, his mind racing with possibilities. He didn't know how he was going to fix this, but one thing was clear. He couldn't run from it. Not this time. As he walked back to his desk, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was a video link. He clicked on it, and his heart sank as he watched footage of the incident from earlier that night. The video, now circulating online, showed him throwing the punch in graphic detail, followed by the shocked reactions of the crowd. The caption read, "When those who swear to protect become the threat." Danny closed his eyes, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a reckoning. And whether he liked it or not, he was going to have to face it head-on. The reckoning. The precinct was quiet, but Danny could feel the storm brewing just beyond its walls. News of his actions had spread like wildfire. The incident was no longer a neighborhood spectacle. It was a national headline. Social media buzzed with outrage, and major news outlets had picked up the story. The video of his punch was everywhere, accompanied by commentary dissecting his every move. Danny sat at his desk, staring at the blank screen of his computer. The folder on Dr. Johnson lay open next to him, the weight of its contents bearing down on him. The more he read about the doctor's work, the more he realized just how deep the damage went. Dr. Johnson wasn't just a respected surgeon. He was a community leader, a man who had dedicated his life to bridging the gap between marginalized communities and the institutions that had long failed them. Now, thanks to Danny, that gap felt wider than ever. Internal Affairs steps in. The knock on the door startled him. He looked up to see Detective Chris Harris from Internal Affairs standing in the doorway, his expression as unreadable as ever. Harris was known for his no-nonsense approach to investigations, and Danny had seen him dismantle careers with clinical precision. "Marks," Harris said, motioning for him to follow. "Let's talk." Danny rose from his chair, his legs feeling like lead. He followed Harris to the small, windowless interrogation room in the back of the precinct. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly as Danny took a seat across from the detective. Harris wasted no time. "You know why you're here," he began, pulling out a recorder and setting it on the table. "Let's get one thing straight. This is serious. The department's reputation is on the line, and so is yours." Danny nodded, his mouth dry. "I understand." "Good," Harris said, leaning forward. "Then start from the beginning. Walk me through exactly what happened." Danny took a deep breath, recounting the events of the night with painstaking detail. He explained the chaos at the scene, the man who had yelled at him, and the split-second decision that led to the punch. He tried to convey his frustration, his fatigue, but as the words left his mouth, they sounded hollow even to him. "So you're telling me," Harris said when Danny finished, "that you let your emotions get the better of you, that you assaulted someone you later discovered was a respected doctor, because you couldn't control yourself." Danny winced at the bluntness of Harris's words. "I didn't know who he was," he said weakly. "It wasn't about him. It was the situation." Harris stared at him, unblinking. "The situation," he repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Do you realize how many officers are out there dealing with the situation every day without throwing punches? You're supposed to be a professional, Marks. What you did wasn't just a lapse in judgment. It was a failure." Danny looked down at his hands, his shame palpable. "I know," he admitted. "I messed up." Harris sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You're damn right you did. And now the department is cleaning up your mess." A community in outrage. The fallout wasn't confined to the precinct. Outside, protesters had begun to gather, their chants echoing through the streets, signs reading "Justice for Dr. Johnson" and "Stop Police Brutality" filled the air as the crowd grew larger by the hour. Danny watched from a second-story window, his stomach twisting with guilt. These weren't just random faces. They were members of the community he had sworn to serve and protect. And now, they were demanding accountability for his actions. Rebecca walked up behind him, her face grim. "It's getting worse," she said. "The mayor's involved now. They're calling for a full investigation." Danny nodded, his eyes still on the crowd. "I deserve it," he said quietly. Rebecca hesitated. "Listen, Danny, I know you screwed up. But if you want any chance of coming back from this, you need to make it right." "How?" Danny asked, turning to face her. "How do I fix something like this?" Rebecca crossed her arms. "Start by owning up to it. No excuses, no justifications. You need to show them you're willing to take responsibility." An unexpected visitor. Later that evening, Danny was called into the captain's office. To his surprise, Dr. Johnson was there, sitting calmly in one of the chairs. His face was bruised, a small bandage covering the corner of his lip, but his posture exuded quiet strength. Danny hesitated in the doorway, unsure of what to say. "Sit down, Marks," Captain Jameson said, his tone clipped. Danny obeyed, his heart pounding. Dr. Johnson's piercing gaze locked onto him, and for a moment, neither man spoke. Finally, the doctor broke the silence. "I'm not here to attack you," Dr. Johnson began, his voice steady. "But I need to understand why you did what you did." Danny swallowed hard. He paused, struggling to find the right words. "I lost control. I was frustrated, and I let my emotions get the better of me. It wasn't about you, Dr. Johnson. It wasn't about race or power. It was me, my failure." Dr. Johnson studied him for a long moment. "Do you understand what your failure cost?" he asked. "It's not just about me, Officer Marks. It's about the message your actions send to the people out there." He gestured toward the window, where the distant sound of chants could still be heard. Those people have been let down by this system time and time again. And when you lashed out, you became the embodiment of that failure. Danny felt a lump rise in his throat. "I know I messed up," he said quietly, "and I'll do whatever it takes to make it right." Dr. Johnson leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Words are a start, but they're not enough. If you're serious about making this right, you need to prove it, not to me, but to them. A plan for redemption." Over the next few days, Danny threw himself into repairing the damage. He met with community leaders, attended public forums, and listened to the stories of those who had lost faith in the police. It was uncomfortable, humbling, and at times, excruciatingly painful, but it was necessary. Dr. Johnson played a crucial role in these efforts, working alongside Danny to bridge the divide. Their partnership was met with skepticism at first, but as they continued to show up, together, the community began to take notice. For Danny, it wasn't about saving his career anymore. It was about rebuilding trust, one conversation at a time. And while the road ahead was long, he was determined to walk it, no matter how difficult it became. The reckoning. Danny's efforts to face the consequences of his actions were met with resistance from all sides. He quickly learned that redemption wasn't just about saying the right words. It was about facing the anger, distrust, and pain he had caused head-on. And that wasn't easy, especially when his every move was scrutinized by the public, the media, and his own department. A public apology. The first major hurdle came in the form of a press conference. The mayor, eager to address the growing unrest, had called for Danny to issue a formal apology. Standing at the podium, surrounded by cameras and microphones, Danny felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. Dr. Johnson stood off to the side, his presence both a reminder of Danny's failure and a source of unexpected support. Despite everything, the doctor had agreed to be there, not to excuse Danny's actions, but to ensure that the focus remained on accountability and systemic change. Danny cleared his throat, gripping the edges of the podium tightly. The room was silent, save for the occasional click of a camera shutter. "I want to start by saying I'm sorry," Danny began, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm sorry for my actions, for the harm I caused Dr. Johnson, and for the pain I've caused this community." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. Reporters watched him with critical eyes, pens poised over notebooks. Members of the community stood at the back, their arms crossed and their expressions skeptical. "What I did was wrong," Danny continued. "There's no excuse for it. I let my emotions get the better of me, and I failed to uphold the values I swore to protect as an officer. For that, I take full responsibility." The room remained silent, the air thick with tension. Danny took a deep breath, preparing to address the elephant in the room. "I understand that my actions are part of a larger issue," he said. "They represent a system that has too often failed to protect and serve all members of our community equally. I can't undo what I've done, but I can commit to being part of the solution moving forward." He stepped back from the podium, his heart pounding in his chest. The room erupted into a flurry of questions, reporters shouting over one another in their eagerness to dissect his words. Danny turned to leave, but not before catching a glimpse of Dr. Johnson's expression. The doctor's face was unreadable, but there was a slight nod of acknowledgement, a small gesture that spoke volumes. A community divided. While some members of the community appreciated Danny's apology, others saw it as little more than damage control. Protesters continued to gather outside the precinct, their chants growing louder and more urgent. Signs demanding justice and systemic reform lined the streets, and social media buzzed with heated debates about accountability, racism, and the role of law enforcement. Danny tried to tune out the noise, but it was impossible to ignore. Everywhere he went, he felt the weight of judgment, both from strangers and from his own colleagues. Some officers offered quiet words of support, but others avoided him entirely, unwilling to associate with someone whose actions had put the entire department under scrutiny. "You've made yourself a lightning rod," Rebecca said one evening as they sat in the precinct's break room. People are using you to channel their anger, their frustration. And honestly, maybe that's exactly what needs to happen." Danny looked at her, surprised. "You think I deserve this?" Rebecca shrugged. "I think you deserve to face the consequences. But more than that, I think this whole system needs to change. And if what you did forces people to have that conversation, then maybe something good can come out of it." Danny didn't know how to respond. He appreciated Rebecca's honesty, but her words only reinforced the magnitude of what he had done. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about an entire system that had been broken for far too long. An unlikely partnership. Dr. Johnson wasn't obligated to help Danny, and yet he did. The doctor's decision to engage with Danny was met with mixed reactions from the community. Some praised his willingness to seek solutions, while others accused him of betraying the cause by working with the man who had assaulted him. "I'm not doing this for you," Dr. Johnson told Danny during one of their meetings. "I'm doing this because the work needs to be done. And if you're serious about being part of the solution, then I'll give you a chance to prove it." Danny nodded, grateful for the opportunity. Together, they began hosting community forums, creating spaces for honest dialogue between residents and law enforcement. The forums were tense at first, with participants voicing years of pent-up anger and distrust. But as the conversations continued, something began to shift. "I grew up in this neighborhood," one man said during a forum, "and I've seen cops treat people like dirt my whole life. So why should I believe anything's going to change now?" Danny looked him in the eye, his voice steady but filled with regret. "Because it has to," he said, "and because I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make sure it does." The man didn't respond, but his expression softened slightly. A small victory in a sea of challenges. A turning point. The real turning point came weeks later when the patient from the ambulance, a young mother named Lila Martinez, regained consciousness. Lila had been in critical condition following a severe car accident, and her recovery was nothing short of miraculous. Dr. Johnson had been instrumental in her care, performing an emergency surgery that saved her life. When Danny visited her in the hospital, accompanied by Dr. Johnson, he expected anger or resentment. Instead, Lila offered him a tentative smile. "I heard what happened," she said, her voice weak but steady. "And I'm not saying it was okay. But if you're really trying to make things right, then good." Her words stayed with Danny long after he left the hospital. They reminded him that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about building a better future, one small step at a time. As the days turned into weeks, Danny's journey toward redemption continued. He knew it wouldn't be easy, and he knew he might never fully earn back the trust he had lost. But with Dr. Johnson by his side and a renewed commitment to the community, he was determined to try. Because in the end, it wasn't about saving his career. It was about doing what was right, no matter the cost. A new battlefield. The days following Lila Martinez's recovery felt like a whirlwind. Despite some progress in repairing the fractured trust between Danny and the community, tensions remained high. The protests outside the precinct showed no signs of subsiding, and media coverage of the incident continued to dominate the airwaves. Every step Danny took toward redemption was met with skepticism, and the weight of his actions still hung heavy on his shoulders. A new challenge. One morning, Danny arrived at the precinct to find Rebecca waiting for him, her face grim. She handed him a thick envelope, the words "Internal Affairs," official review stamped across the front. "This is it," she said simply. "They've concluded their investigation." Danny stared at the envelope, his stomach churning. He knew what was inside. A summary of his actions, the department's findings, and the recommendation for disciplinary action. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, as if it contained not just words but his entire career. "Open it," Rebecca urged. Danny hesitated before tearing the envelope open. His hand shook slightly as he unfolded the letter and began to read. The words blurred together at first, but one sentence stood out like a beacon. "Officer Daniel Marks is hereby placed on unpaid suspension for a period of 90 days. pending mandatory counseling and community outreach commitments. He exhaled slowly, relief mingling with uncertainty. It wasn't the worst outcome, but it wasn't a clean slate either. The department was giving him a chance he wasn't sure he deserved. Dr. Johnson's request. Later that day, Danny met with Dr. Johnson at a local community center. The doctor had asked him to attend a meeting with several community leaders, and though Danny felt out of place, he knew he couldn't refuse. The room was filled with a mix of faces: activists, local business owners, and even a few clergy members. They greeted Dr. Johnson warmly, but their expressions hardened when they saw Danny. He felt their eyes on him as he took a seat at the back of the room. "Thank you all for being here," Dr. Johnson began, his voice steady and authoritative. "As you know, we're here to discuss the recent incident and how we can move forward as a community." A woman with silver-streaked hair and a no-nonsense demeanor spoke up first, moving forward. "That's easy for you to say, Dr. Johnson. You're giving this man a chance, but what about the rest of us? What about the people who've been hurt by officers like him and never got an apology?" Her words stung, but Danny couldn't deny their truth. He stood, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "You're right," he said, his voice firm but humble. "What I did was inexcusable, and I know an apology isn't enough. But I'm here because I want to listen. I want to learn how I can help rebuild the trust I broke." The room was silent for a moment, and then another voice chimed in. "Talk is cheap, Officer Marks. What are you actually going to do?" Danny looked to Dr. Johnson for guidance. The doctor nodded, a small but encouraging gesture. "I started attending community forums," Danny said. "I'm working on better understanding the struggles this neighborhood faces, and I've committed to participating in the department's new outreach programs." The silver-haired woman raised an eyebrow. "That's a start, but it's not enough." "I know," Danny replied. "But I'm not going to stop. This isn't about saving my job. It's about doing what's right." A test of commitment. After the meeting, Dr. Johnson pulled Danny aside. "There's something else I want you to do," he said, "something that might help you understand what's at stake." "What is it?" Danny asked. "I run a program for at-risk youth," Dr. Johnson explained. "These kids have grown up seeing police as enemies, not protectors. I want you to come talk to them. Share your story, your mistakes, and show them that people can change." Danny hesitated. The idea of standing in front of a group of teenagers who likely despised him was daunting, but he couldn't say no. "I'll do it," he said finally. The following week, Danny found himself in a small gymnasium filled with about 20 teenagers. They sat in a semicircle, their expressions ranging from bored to outright hostile. Dr. Johnson introduced him, but the room remained silent. Danny cleared his throat. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from," he began. "And I don't blame you. I messed up, badly. I hurt someone, and I betrayed the trust of my community." One of the teens, a boy with a defiant glare, crossed his arms. "So, why are you here? To make yourself feel better?" "No," Danny said honestly. "I'm here because I want to change, and because I want to help make sure that what I did never happens again." The boy scoffed, but another teen, a girl with piercing eyes, spoke up. "How do we know you're not just saying this because you got caught?" Danny nodded, acknowledging her skepticism. "You don't. All I can do is show you through my actions." The session continued, with the teens peppering him with questions and criticisms. By the end, Danny felt drained, but he also felt something he hadn't in weeks: hope. If he could reach even one of those kids, maybe his mistake could serve a purpose. The turning point. Over time, Danny's presence in the community began to shift perceptions. He worked tirelessly, volunteering at events, attending meetings, and continuing to collaborate with Dr. Johnson. He wasn't forgiven by everyone. Some wounds ran too deep, but he started to earn respect from those who saw his efforts as genuine. One evening, As he and Dr. Johnson walked back to their cars after a long day of community work, the doctor turned to him. "You've come a long way, Marks," he said. "But remember, this isn't a finish line. It's just the beginning." Danny nodded, understanding the truth in those words. Redemption wasn't a destination. It was a journey, one he was committed to for the rest of his life. A new battlefield. Danny sat in his car outside the community center after his first session with the teens. The weight of their questions lingered in his mind, replaying like a broken record. Why should we believe you? What makes you different from the rest of them? Their skepticism had been raw, their frustration palpable. And yet Danny couldn't blame them. He had once been in a position of trust, and he had shattered it with a single thoughtless act. The headlights of another car pulled into the lot, snapping him out of his thoughts. Dr. Johnson stepped out, his stride confident despite the late hour. He tapped on Danny's window, gesturing for him to roll it down. "How'd it go?" Dr. Johnson asked, leaning against the car. Danny let out a heavy sigh. "They don't trust me. Hell, I wouldn't trust me." Dr. Johnson nodded knowingly. Trust isn't something you can rebuild overnight, especially not with kids who've seen too much to believe in second chances. "I'm trying," Danny said, his voice tinged with frustration. "But it feels like no matter what I do, it's never enough." "It won't be, for a while," Dr. Johnson replied. "But that's the point. If this were easy, it wouldn't mean anything." Danny looked away, his gaze fixed on the faint glow of the streetlights. "Why are you helping me?" he asked. "After what I did to you, you could have walked away. You should have." Dr. Johnson's expression softened. "Because this isn't just about you, Officer Marks. It's about all of us. This community needs change, and if I can help turn someone who was part of the problem into part of the solution, I'll do it. But make no mistake, this is on you to prove you're worth the effort." Danny nodded, the weight of Dr. Johnson's words settling heavily on his shoulders. "I won't let you down," he said quietly. "You'd better not," Dr. Johnson replied, his tone firm but not unkind. "Because if you do, it won't just be me you're letting down. It'll be everyone who gave you a second chance." Facing the protesters, the following week brought a new challenge. A coalition of activists had organized a large protest outside the precinct, demanding not only Danny's resignation, but also broader reforms within the department. Signs and banners filled the streets, their bold lettering calling for justice and accountability. Danny watched from the second-floor window, his stomach churning. He had faced public anger before, but this felt different. This wasn't just about him. It was about the system he represented, a system that had failed too many people for too long. "Are you just going to stand there?" Rebecca's voice cut through his thoughts. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You could go talk to them, you know." Danny turned to her, his expression incredulous. "You think they want to hear from me?" Rebecca shrugged. "Maybe not, but you're not going to fix anything by hiding up here." Danny hesitated, but her words struck a chord. If he was serious about making amends, he couldn't avoid the people he had hurt. Taking a deep breath, he made his way downstairs and stepped out into the cool evening air. The crowd noticed him immediately. The chants faltered for a moment before someone shouted, "There he is, the cop who punched a doctor." A wave of anger surged through the protesters, their voices rising in unison. Danny raised his hands, palms open, a gesture of surrender. "I'm not here to argue," he called out. "I just want to listen." The crowd quieted slightly, their skepticism palpable. A man stepped forward, his face lined with years of hard living. "Listen," he spat. "You've done enough talking, cop. We don't need your words." Danny met his gaze, his voice steady but filled with regret. "I know I don't deserve your trust, but I want to understand, really understand, what needs to change. Because what I did was wrong, and I can't fix it if I don't listen to the people I hurt." The man stared at him for a long moment before stepping back into the crowd. Another voice chimed in. a young woman holding a sign that read "Justice for Dr. Johnson." "You say you want to listen," she said, her voice sharp. "So what are you going to do about the system that lets cops like you get away with this?" Danny swallowed hard. "I don't have all the answers," he admitted, "but I'm working with Dr. Johnson and others in the community to make things right, and I'm committed to pushing for changes within the department." "Words," someone muttered from the back. "They are," Danny agreed. "And I know words aren't enough. But I'm here, I'm listening, and I'm going to do everything I can to prove that I mean it." The crowd murmured among themselves, their anger still simmering but slightly tempered. Danny didn't expect applause or acceptance. He was there to listen, not to be forgiven. And as the protesters continued their chants, he stood quietly, absorbing their pain and their demands, determined to carry them with him in the work ahead. Small steps, big changes. Over the next few weeks, Danny's presence in the community became more frequent. He worked alongside Dr. Johnson to address long-standing issues between law enforcement and residents. Together, they organized town halls, advocated for body cameras, and pushed for de-escalation training within the department. Not everyone welcomed his efforts, and Danny knew there were some wounds he could never heal, but he didn't let that stop him. Every conversation, every meeting, every difficult moment was a step forward, however small. One evening, after a particularly heated town hall, Danny found himself sitting on the steps of the community center, exhaustion weighing heavily on him. Dr. Johnson joined him, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You've come a long way," the doctor said after a long silence. "But you know this isn't the end, right?" Danny nodded. "I know, and I'm not stopping." Dr. Johnson smiled faintly. "Good, because this work, this fight, it doesn't have an end. But as long as you're willing to keep walking this path, you'll make a difference." Danny looked out at the quiet street, the distant echoes of the day's protests still ringing in his ears. He knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of purpose, a reason to keep moving forward. A path forward. Months had passed since that fateful night, but for Danny, the echoes of his mistake were still loud and clear. His suspension had ended, but returning to active duty wasn't the victory it once might have felt like. Instead, it was a sobering reminder that the uniform he wore was now a symbol of both his failure and the work he still had to do. The neighborhood where the incident had occurred was still wary of him. Every patrol brought hesitant glances, whispered conversations, and the occasional outright confrontation. Danny had expected this. He welcomed it. These were the consequences of his actions, and he was determined to face them. A new role. Captain Jameson called Danny into his office one afternoon. The older man's expression was guarded, his hands folded neatly on the desk. "Marks," he began, "we've been keeping an eye on your work since the suspension ended. You've been doing well, better than expected, frankly." "Thank you, sir," Danny said, though his voice lacked the confidence it once held. Jameson leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "But let's be clear. You're not just another officer anymore. You're a symbol, whether you like it or not, and the department is looking to use that." Danny frowned. "Use it how?" Jameson slid a folder across the desk. "We're starting a pilot program. Community Policing Initiative. The idea is to build bridges between the department and the neighborhoods we serve. You'll be leading it." Danny hesitated, flipping through the folder. It outlined plans for officers to work directly with community leaders, host events, and prioritize de-escalation and relationship building over enforcement. It was the kind of initiative he'd been advocating for alongside Dr. Johnson, but seeing his name at the top of the roster felt like a weight. "Why me?" he asked. Jameson's gaze softened, but only slightly. "Because you've lived it. You've seen what happens when things go wrong, and you've worked to make it right. That gives you a perspective most officers don't have. People might not trust you yet, but they'll watch you. And maybe, just maybe, they'll start to believe in what you're trying to do." Danny nodded slowly. "I'll do it." Bridging the divide. The Community Policing Initiative began with skepticism on all sides. Many officers resented the program, seeing it as a distraction from their traditional duties. Community members were hesitant to engage, unsure if the department's efforts were genuine or just another PR stunt. Danny spent his days meeting with residents, listening to their concerns, and addressing their frustrations. He partnered with Dr. Johnson to organize events, from block cleanups to job fairs. These gatherings served as a neutral ground, a place where officers and residents could interact as people rather than adversaries. One particularly impactful event was a youth and police workshop. Danny and several other officers sat down with a group of local teens to discuss their experiences with law enforcement. The conversations were raw and emotional, with the teens sharing stories of fear, distrust, and anger. "You guys don't know what it's like," one boy said, his voice shaking. "Every time I see a cop, I think, is this it? Is this the day I get stopped for no reason? Is this the day I don't make it home?" Danny's throat tightened as he listened. "You're right," he said after a long pause. "I don't know what that's like, but I want to change it. I want you to see us and think, that's someone who's here to help me. And I know I've got a long way to go before I can earn that trust." Facing Elijah Thompson. As Danny's work in the community progressed, a new challenge emerged. Elijah Thompson, the man whose actions had triggered the chaotic events of that night, had resurfaced. Thompson was a known gang affiliate, and his presence had always been a source of tension in the neighborhood. Danny learned through whispers and rumors that Thompson was back to his old ways, intimidating business owners, recruiting teens, and perpetuating the cycle of violence. The knowledge filled Danny with a mix of anger and dread. Thompson had been the spark that led to his downfall, but confronting him now would mean risking everything he'd worked to rebuild. It wasn't long before their paths crossed. Danny was patrolling a park when he saw Thompson sitting on a bench, flanked by two younger men. They were laughing, their postures relaxed, but the tension in the air was palpable. Danny approached cautiously, his hand resting near his belt, not on his weapon, but close enough to reassure himself. "Thompson," he said evenly. Thompson looked up, a slow smirk spreading across his face. "Well, if it isn't the fallen cop," he drawled. "What brings you to my neck of the woods?" "Just checking in," Danny replied. "Making sure everyone's playing nice." Thompson chuckled, leaning back. "Relax, Officer Marks. We're just enjoying the sunshine." Danny didn't rise to the bait. "You and I both know that's not why you're here." Thompson's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating glare. "Careful, Marks. You're not exactly in a position to throw accusations around." Danny met his gaze, unflinching. "Maybe not, but I am in a position to protect this community. And I will." Thompson stared at him for a long moment before standing. "We'll see about that," he said, brushing past Danny. As Thompson walked away, Danny felt a chill run down his spine. The man's words weren't a threat. They were a promise. And Danny knew the road ahead was about to get even more difficult. A small victory. Despite the challenges, there were moments of hope. One evening, Danny received a call from Leila Martinez. She had returned to her job as a school teacher and wanted to thank him for his efforts in the community. "I heard about the youth workshops," she said. "My students have been talking about them. They're starting to see officers as people, not just uniforms. That's because of you." Danny's chest tightened with a mix of gratitude and guilt. "I don't deserve the credit," he said, "but thank you. That means a lot." "You do deserve it," Leila replied. "You made a mistake, but you're trying to make it right. That matters." For the first time in months, Danny felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't there yet. He might never truly be there, but he was moving in the right direction. And for now, that was enough. A path forward. As the months turned into a year, Danny's work with the Community Policing Initiative began to yield tangible results. Crime rates in the neighborhood decreased. Trust between officers and residents grew, and the conversations that had once been tense and confrontational became more collaborative. Dr. Johnson continued to be a guiding force, pushing Danny to confront uncomfortable truths and hold himself accountable. Their partnership evolved into a genuine friendship, built on mutual respect and a shared commitment to change. One evening, as they stood outside the community center after another successful event, Dr. Johnson turned to Danny. "You've come a long way," he said. "But remember, this isn't the end." Danny nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I know. It's just the beginning." And as he looked out at the neighborhood he had once let down, Danny felt a renewed sense of purpose. He couldn't erase the past, but he could build a better future, one step at a time.